My name is Melanie Scott-Dockery, and I'm an artist. I also teach art appreciation at Lincoln College. My background is training in painting. I studied at the University of Southern Indiana, at Indiana University in finally at Northern Illinois University, where I finished an MFA in painting in 2004. A few years ago, I started to shift to study working with plant dyes and to work with paper making. And welcome to my garden. My yard's a little under 2 acres. A lot of it is landscaped with edibles or with native prairie plants. And much of my inspiration for my art making process is pulled from these plants and flowers. Well, while I was studying painting, one of the things I became fascinated with was impermanence and how to capture ideas of impermanence and change in paint. So I started painting these sort of light-filled color fields, and that led me to start thinking about light and movement a lot. And that's what I sense a lot working in the garden, light and movement. I'm always watching the weather, the sun, the clouds, the wind, to see what's shifting and moving in the garden, but also movement is the growth cycle. Planting the plants, watching them grow. Some last from year to year, some only live 1 year, and watching all these different cycles intertwine is very lush and fun for me and inspiring. Going back to the paintings, when I was trying to capture impermanence and change, I was finishing these paintings, and I was like, wow, like that idea might be kind of represented there, but this is a solid object that's not changing. And I started pondering what I could create that does change. And I started researching paper making, I started researching dyes and fabric, and eventually that's led me to working with plant dyes on paper. And for the process, I'll harvest blooms from the garden. I have a particular love for black tulips and black petunias and purple pansies because they make these really lush violets and blues. Sometimes they turn green though, depending on the sunlight, and if they have a little geranium mixed in. So I'll pick the blooms from the garden and I'll soak them in water or vinegar or actually kombucha sometimes to extract the dye and the color, and I paint that on a sheet of paper. And right now, the sheets of paper I'm painting on are ones I purchase. Like this summer, I spent a lot of time working with large sheets of Reeves BFK drawing paper. And I paint the dye on the paper, and it's actually very reminiscent of the way I used to paint with oils and acrylics on canvas, just looking for these subtle shifts of color. But then after the dye has dried, I will lay bits and pieces of flower material or fallen leaves on top of the surface of the paper. And then I'll lay a cover, usually plexiglass, over the paper and the blooms and expose it to the sun for 1 day. And at the end of the day, I uncover it to see what's happened. And sometimes the plants that I laid on the surface have added some of their own dyes and colors. Sometimes they leave behind some of the remnants, almost embedding themselves in the paper. And the finished product's organic and shifting and changing. One of the things that I'm trying to embrace and really love about this process, and I do love it, but I have some hesitancy with it, is these images will only last so long. The plant dyes themselves are fugitive, meaning that they will fade and change over time. So I've created some images, say 3 or 4 years ago, that were lush turquoise, and today they've turned a brown like the earth, but yet they have a certain beauty in that change and shift. Okay. Working with the anthotypes, particularly this summer, when I was working on the large sheets of BFK paper, I was looking for a surface to lay the paper on when I was planting the dye on. When I worked on little sheets, I didn't think about this as much. I'd work on a towel or another sheet of paper. But with these big sheets, I needed something large. So I pulled some old canvas out of my studio and started painting the sheets of paper on the canvas. And the dye would roll around the big sheets of paper, roll under them, and stain the canvas underneath. And it was an accidental discovery of these sort of shifting color fields that almost felt very shroud-like, because sometimes images of the plants after the paper was exposed to the sun would still be on the canvas, but it was very worn and barely discernible. And noticing that, I started to wonder what would happen if I actually did make paper on these large sheets of canvas after anthotyping on them. So I started actually just using a little tiny around 5x7 screen and picking up little batches of pulp and shifting and pushing and sculpting the pulp together. I started to make larger sheets on these canvases, and the dyes, the residual dyes that were left from the anthotyping started to seep up into the paper. And I have a sense of what's happening in the process. I understand it, but I don't have absolute control, because accidents happen, and a leaf might blow across and put an indentation in a piece of paper, or an unexpected rainstorm comes and hits, or a gust of wind blows the paper or the anthotypes apart. And that's taking me around to another part of this. I'm interested in the cycles of nature, and that element of change and impermanence that's there. But as I've been working this summer, I'm feeling a relationship with nature build. And that was there at the beginning when I first started harvesting blooms. I always thought, I'm not going to take all the blooms, because I want to leave some for the bees and the butterflies. So I would take some and I would leave some. And even today, the sun's starting to set, and I want to harvest some passion flower vines for part of the installation at the McLean County Arts Center. But I'm waiting till the end of the day when the bees have had a chance to gather as much pollen as possible out of those blooms. Then I'll trim some of the vines back and let them start drying so I can bring them into the gallery.
The Arts Center.
McLean County Arts Center is such a great space for to display the variety of talent and creativity that's happening in the community, and I love to be a part of that. And I'm glad that I'm mixed in a group show with other artists that are working with these ideas of permanence and impermanence and nature and change, because just walking into the space and seeing what we're all working on, there's a conversation there. And the Arts Center, connections to the Arts Center, with some of us still living here locally or once living here locally, brings us together to share in that conversation with each other.